Hi, I'm Steve, and welcome to Sights Less Seen, where I visit those maybe not so well known places you may not find in the normal tourist guide. Today, I'm in Coffeyville, Kansas, where in 1892, the Dalton Gang attempted to rob two banks at the same time. Those banks were the Condon Bank behind me and the First National Bank right across the street from it. They did not succeed, and the subsequent gunfight resulted in the deaths of 4 out of the 5 gang members and 4 Coffeyville citizens. Coffeyville lies in the southeast portion of Kansas, just a few miles from the Oklahoma state line. One thing I thought was interesting was that, coming out of Missouri from the east, the terrain changes quickly from rolling hills covered with grass and trees to a fairly flat plain with a lot less trees. It's like it turns into a vast prairie right at the Missouri-Kansas state line. In 1892, during the attempted bank robbery, Coffeyville's population was about 2,300 people, a place where just about everybody knew everybody else. And this turned out to be a big contributor to the Daltons' failed bank robbery attempt. As you can see here, the two targeted banks, the Condon Bank and the First National Bank, were across the street from each other in the center of Coffeyville. The Condon Bank sits between Walnut Street on the left and Union Street on the right. These two streets merge together in front of a bank. Union Street doesn't exist anymore, and this area is now a small walking plaza. Across the street to the left is Death Alley, where the Daltons were killed. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Unfortunately, the First National Bank burned down in the late 1890s, and I couldn't find any pictures of it anywhere. Its location is now a parking lot right next to Ism Hardware. The building on the right is Ism Hardware, where several citizens grabbed guns during the robbery. Interestingly, it still exists as a hardware store and is still called Ism Hardware. At the time of the Coffeyville raid in 1892, the Dalton Gang consisted of Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton, along with Dick Broadwell and Bill Power. There had been other members in and out of the gang, but circumstances led to these 5 ending up in Coffeyville. The Dalton brothers were cousins of the Younger family, who, along with Jesse and Frank James, were basically shot to pieces when they tried to rob the bank in Northfield, Minnesota in 1876. This resulted in the end of the James Gang forever. Surprisingly, Bob, Grat, and Emmett were initially law officers working for federal judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge, in Fort Smith, Arkansas. An older brother, Frank, had previously worked for Judge Parker, but had been killed in the line of duty. Their appointments probably were more sentimental than anything because of Frank. They definitely were not law officer material. Due to some unfortunate shooting incidents by Bob and Emmett, which were deemed justified but under very suspicious conditions, violation of some federal laws which they were supposed to enforce, and a continual dispute over salaries being unpaid, Bob and Emmett quit in 1890 and decided to visit their brother Bill in California, who at the time was a legitimate rancher. But they needed money, so they stole some horses and sold them. This led to a posse being formed to find them. However, they were able to successfully get away to California. Grat eventually followed in early 1891 after being fired. Being in California didn't help much, as they eventually robbed a train. Now this is considered the beginning of what is now called the Dalton Gang. They continued this type of activity all the way back to Kansas. In all, over just a little more than 2 years, they robbed 4 trains and 4 banks before the attempt in Coffeyville. At the time of a Coffeyville raid, a posse was closing in on them and was only about a day away. Bob Dalton was considered the smart one of the gang, which, considering future events, wasn't saying much. And he had big ambitions. He would, he claimed, beat anything that Jesse James ever did. He would rob 2 banks at once, in broad daylight. Plus, this would provide them with enough money to go to South America and live like kings for the rest of their lives. He planned the entire robbery, and it was foolproof, he said. 2 of the gang would rob the First National Bank, and the 3 others would rob the Condon Bank directly across the street. Emmett, however, was against the idea. He was afraid that some of his friends would be hurt, but Bob reassured him that there wouldn't be any shooting and that it would be all over before anyone knew what happened. And this is where the mistakes began. First, the Daltons were very well known in Coffeyville. They had lived there for a while and had many friends. Even with their disguises, which were pretty much just fake mustaches, they were recognized. Second, Bob had planned for the gang to tie their horses to a hitching post right behind the Condon Bank, where they'd be quick and easy to get to. However, when they arrived, the hitching post wasn't there, and Bob had to think of something else. He decided to tie their horses in an alley across the bank to the west, basically across from the city jail, which offered them very little protection. This is now known as Death Alley. Third, they carried rifles into the banks, trying to hide them under their coats. It didn't work. Fourth, the three outlaws in the Condon Bank were duped into believing the safe was on a time lock and wouldn't open for 10 minutes. They made the fatal decision to wait for it. And fifth, they were doing this all in broad daylight in the middle of a busy day. During all of this time, a man who had recognized them gave a verbal alarm and alerted the citizens to the robbery. Many began grabbing guns, mostly from Ism Hardware, right next to the First National Bank. When the robbers left the two banks, they were confronted by a massive gunfire. They had to get to their horses, and the only way they knew was down the alley next to the Condon Bank. They didn't make it. 3 of the 5 were killed in what is now called Death Alley. The 4th actually did get to his horse, was shot, and died just outside of town. The 12-minute gunfight resulted in Grat and Bob Dalton, Dick Broadwell, and Bill Power being killed. Emmett Dalton received 23 gunshot wounds, but amazingly survived. Additionally, 4 citizens were killed, including the city marshal, who also died in Death Alley. Emmett Dalton actually lucked out. I mean, he did live. He was given a life sentence in the Kansas State Penitentiary. However, he served only 14 years before being pardoned by the governor in 1907. He moved to Hollywood, California, and became a real estate agent, an author, and an actor. He died in 1937 at the age of 66. Your first stop should be at the Dalton Defenders Museum. It's a small museum, but it is chock full of information about the robbery, with some personal items of the Dalton brothers, including Bob Dalton's pocket pistol, Grat Dalton's rifle, and even Emmett Dalton's business card from his time in Hollywood. Additionally, it has memorabilia and photos from the history of the town. Then stop at the Condon Bank right across the street. The back part of the bank is the Coffeyville Visitor Center. When they're open, you can go inside the bank at no cost and see firsthand exactly how it looked in 1892. As I mentioned earlier, the First National Bank burned down in the 1890s, but it was located right next to Ism Hardware. There's a small plaque on the sidewalk where it stood. Then walk down Death Alley, right next to the museum and across the street from the Condon Bank. The jail's still there, and you can easily imagine the desperate fight that took place back then in October of 1892. Did you know that Coffeyville is the birthplace of the icy drink? You know that cold drink you can get in just about any store nowadays, including the convenience stores? It was invented in 1958 by a Dairy Queen owner named Omar Needlick. When his soda machine broke down, he put all his bottles of soda in a freezer to keep them cold. He then sold them, and as soon as they were opened, the soda would turn into a slush. And you can buy one in the Condon Bank. And yes, Ices and Slurpees are the exact same thing, owned by the same company. It's just that 7-Eleven has a licensing deal to call them Slurpees. The Dalton Gang wanted to do something to outshine the James Gang, to make a name for themselves. Well, they succeeded, only not in the way they anticipated. Hope you enjoyed the video. My name is Steve. I'll see you next time on Sights Less Seen.